through it all, I had a brother, but I didn't know that. And I didn't find out I had a brother until I was 14. And it turned out that there was quite a story, which by the time I got to hear the story, I knew enough about keeping family secrets, especially ones connected to politics that might get people into trouble, that I just heard the information and just went with it. And the story that I heard was that after my parents got together in 1928, they met at a Communist Party leadership training school in Woodland, Washington. And my dad was an instructor, and my mother was young rising star of the Young Communist League in Southern California. And she was sent up by the party in Southern California to the school in Woodland, Washington, and they met and sparks flew and fires were lit, and that was the beginning of their life together. So that was in 1928. And then just over a year later, my brother was born. They were down in Southern California, my brother Tim. And right about that time, my father, who had been involved in a lot of union organizing campaigns and workers' rights struggles, because at that time union organizing had even fewer of the legal protections that they have had since the 30s. So that union organizers were, aside from being beaten and arrested, were often indicted under criminal syndicalist laws and others that carried very heavy sentences. And so my dad was busted a couple of times out in the valley for organizing farm workers and migrant workers. And an indictment was issued, and there was a party decision that he and others who had been indicted from this organizing campaign were to go underground, not to allow themselves to be arrested. And then while he was underground, the party made the decision that he was too important to the party to spend time in prison. Now we're talking about 1930. The party changed its point of view later on, but in 1930 they wanted him out of the country. And there was a real close relationship at that time between the Communist Party and the Communist International headquartered in Moscow in the USSR. And it was considered a privilege and an honor for American communists to go to Moscow to work for and with the Comintern. So that's where my dad went. That's where he was sent by the party. My mother did not know this. All she knew was that he went underground. She was living with her parents, Jewish immigrants from Russia, and with my baby brother, Tim. And she just went along. I mean, she also knew that it was politically related, but she had no idea where my dad was. And there were some cryptic messages delivered by third parties and so forth that he was okay, but that he couldn't reveal yet where he was or when they would be back together, but that day would come and she should be ready. Well, the day came and she was told, be ready. I can't remember if it was in 24 hours or 72 hours or whatever. And so she bundled up the baby and went off on a journey following party instructions that ended up in Moscow. And that's where she and my dad reconnected. And that's where my brother, from the time he was 2, was raised. And in the 30s, in the middle 30s, the Communist International was active on every continent. I mean, there were the international workers' movement under Marxism, Leninism was in Africa, and was in Asia, in all parts of Asia and Europe. And I'm not sure exactly why, but my dad was given assignments over and over again in the Philippines and South Africa and China. And traveling into those parts of the world at that time was really hazardous. And my mother was given some responsibilities in Moscow at the Comintern, but also she was given courier assignments to deliver party instructions, documents, whatever, in Europe. And so since my parents are engaged in hazardous work and underground work and traveling illegally for erratic periods and so forth, my brother was raised in the arms of comrades in Moscow. Some were Soviets, some were from other countries. And then my parents came back to the U.S. under travel conditions that were not conducive to bringing, he was more than a toddler or whatever at that point. But again, it was going to be safer to keep Tim in Moscow. And then World War II broke out in earnest. And my parents wanted to get Tim back. And now with hindsight and the revelation of certain documents and so forth and certain autobiographies written by other party people, and it turned out that while my parents were being told that Moscow didn't want my brother brought back into the States, it was the American party that didn't want him brought back in the States, because by the time World War II is happening, my brother is now a Russian speaker. English is a distant second language for him. So the idea of having prominent communists with a kid that is speaking Russian fluently, not English, at best heavily accented Russian, was something that would create a lot of political problems for the party. And so the decision was made that Tim was staying in Moscow. And fortunately for him, he was kept at an orphanage, it was called, but were sons and daughters of leading Soviet party officials as well as the other Comintern leaders' kids were kept. So they were as safe as anybody could be in the Soviet Union during the war. And then after the war, Tim decided that he was going to stay there. When he reached the point, he was going to be entering Moscow University after World War II, one of the youngest ever. He was a really bright guy and was doing very well. And so he had to make a choice, and so he chose to stay there. So this whole saga is going on, and I know nothing about it. The first I hear about it is I see some pictures on a mantelpiece. I can't tell you right now whose house it was in. Was it our house? Was it a relative's house? Was it somebody's house? And I thought they were pictures of me. I was told when I was real young that they were pictures of me. But I noticed these pictures, and I said something about the pictures, and that's when my mother decided to tell me the story. So I said, okay, so I got this brother over there, and maybe someday I'll get to see him, but until then I can't tell anybody about him. Well, the secrets don't last hidden all that long, and there had been a few times when some of the more conservative or right-wing newspapers and columnists had gotten wind of this Eugene and Peggy Dennis having this Russian kid. And then in 19 1960, when Khrushchev came to the United States to speak at the United Nations, he had an entourage, a Soviet entourage of journalists and advisors and so forth. And there was a big splash in the New York newspapers that one of these advisors was Timur Timofeyev, son of Eugene and Peggy Dennis. So I was in Madison in my freshman year when this happened, and I was given a heads up by my parents that this might get a lot of media attention, and I might, be hearing from the media or whatever. So I knew it was happening, but I did not get to meet Tim at that time. And but this was around November, I think, of 1960. Anyway, Dad died at the end of January, and Tim came to his funeral. And we spent a couple of weeks together, and it was great. It was like we had never been separated. He talked funny. But there was just that, that sense that we had that family connection that siblings have. I mean, I had never experienced it before, but I said, oh, this is what it means. And so since 1961, we have seen each other infrequently, but over the years we've been in touch and sort of keep up to a certain degree. It's not always been easy for him living in the Soviet Union and then in the new Russia. That being the son of American parents and a Jewish mother did not always fly well in the Soviet Union of Stalin. And so depending on who was in power over there, Tim had to either cover up or promote his roots. And so he was doing a dance not too different from the dance that I was doing here in the USA. And Tim's work, while he did a lot of journalism, he got a PhD in history, and his specialty was the American labor movement. And he became, as a member of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, he was made the director of best way to describe it is a think tank on economic and social policy of workers and unions. And so there he is doing that over in the Soviet Union, Russia, because he survived, his agency survived after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And today he's retired from that position, but he has a similar position as an emeritus for another think tank type agency, which they're all privatized and getting research contracts from universities and government agencies, both Russian and European and whatever. So he's over there and I'm here, and occasionally we meet.